2 weeks ago, we did real-time triage on the business emergency room. Real-time triage on 2 business emergencies. Today, I want to go backwards. Because major business emergencies almost never start with one big dramatic event. They start with compromises, assumptions, pressure, little cracks nobody thinks matter yet. And then one day, all the cracks line up.
Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room.
Thanks for tuning in to the Business Emergency Room today. I'm glad you're here. Let's start with a recap of those cases we talked about 2 weeks ago. We talked about CDK, the cyber incident. CDK is a company that provides much of the software and platforms and systems that the car dealerships around the US run on. And we also talked about the Mississippi liquor distribution breakdown case. The single warehouse, who is the axis of that distribution system, basically going in and out. Well, that CDK case is really interesting from a business continuity perspective. But honestly, if your entire business depends on systems, if your entire business really is systems, you already know that outages are going to be possible. The real lesson here is that you need to do business continuity planning, and that you need scenario testing, and you need wargaming, and you need to practice your response to these incidents. I'll come back to that later, because I do think that many businesses treat business continuity planning like a binder on a shelf. Let's start with the liquor case, because that one is fascinating because you can almost see the buildup happen in slow motion. Let me remind you of what happened here. This was a formerly state-run warehouse. Liquor distribution in Mississippi is heavily state-controlled, and there is really only one central distribution warehouse that was state-run for the longest time and had been relatively recently privatized. So there is a monopoly structure here in place, right? And a business that's privatized, or an operation that's privatized, and really changes from a maybe not necessarily for-profit to a for-profit type operation. So this new owner inherited somewhat of a constrained system, yeah? This was never a clean sheet commercial business. And what the buyer inherited here were legacy systems, legacy culture, government constraints, also pressure. A monopoly can sound really good, but can come with a lot of challenges. There were no doubt critical requirements in the contract they signed around performance being the monopoly. And hence, there were probably unrealistic expectations in there. I have zero doubt that within months or within weeks, the buyer, the organization who took over operations of that warehouse, realized that what they thought they bought and what they did buy were not necessarily the same, right? They probably found out that things were harder than expected, or that they had challenges in areas that they had not foreseen. I'm not saying at all that the buyer was stupid, but transition environments are messy, and there's gonna be surprises. What I see all the time after acquisitions or transitions is that these organizations realize pretty quickly that reality is different from what they bought. The challenge is that we then all decide to limp on anyway. The deal is done. It is what it is. That's what we say to ourselves. So what do we start doing, right? We do patch jobs. We're like, okay, this isn't what I wanted. Well, I'll learn to live with it. Or I'll tweak it enough so I can get today done with what I'm supposed to be doing today. I'll make it work. But then these temporary fixes become permanent because it's always today. And there's always something that needs to happen today. And then you get operational compromises. We start talking about, well, we'll deal with it later. We get frustrated. We complain about it. We build up some resentment. But the reality is, it's much easier to pull big levers early than once the organization settles into a routine, even if that routine is dysfunctional. So I suspect, right, I have to remind you that I don't know any of the ins and outs, but what my go-to in cases like this is to go and say, all right, we've now been in it a couple of weeks or a couple of months. What is all not what we expected? You need a rebaselining after the deal, because that's the time that you can still make amends. That's the time that you can say, okay, this is truly very different than we expected. And yes, we could probably live with anything, but should we, right? Should we? There is definitely things you're going to find that you should choose to not live with and fix or change early. Then let's dive into people dynamics. I am pretty sure that if I would have been invited in to be the ears and the walls, that we would have found that there is people challenges that led to this situation. What happens in these types of transitions is that I would assume they maintain or retained a significant part of the legacy personnel. And that's the right thing to do, right? These are the people who are doing the work, how it works. They are no doubt capable. They're already there. But no doubt the new organization also brought in some of its own, right? So they might have brought in new leadership, and they might have brought in people from other locations where they do similar work because they want to bring their culture into the mix. Yeah, there is a reason that this operation was moved on. So there was likely a certain belief that the old way of running that operation as a state-run organization was not efficient or effective. The buying party, no doubt, saw ways to improve or change that efficiency, and that will have been reflected in people changes. The challenge then is that you have likely more commercial-oriented newcomers, and that there is a need for a culture shift to more commercially focused operations, that there's going to be different incentives in the new world versus the old world. But also, if that's not very explicit, people don't necessarily change towards that immediately, right? There's also different language, there's different risk appetite. And in a world like that, power is knowledge. So yes, I'm assuming everybody will be friendly. I'm assuming everybody will be spending time getting to know each other. Everybody will reassure each other that they're going to do this with the new team together. But there's not immediately trust, right? There is not immediately trust that if I'm legacy personnel, that I truly get to keep my job. If I really would transfer all the knowledge I have, am I doing that and basically digging my own grave, right? As soon as that knowledge is transferred, do I lose my value to this new organization? And so people are going to be somewhat guarded. They're going to hold stuff back. People protect because they want to be relevant. There will also be information filters, right? So in their quest to find out from new staff or new organization or leadership that now sits elsewhere, right? It could very well be that this warehouse now is part of a much larger organization. There is people on the front line who are trying to read what's happening on the ground in this new operation and will feed that back to headquarters, but they will feed that back through their lenses and with their biases. And so information gets filtered and maybe not necessarily efficiently. They might be asking questions using jargon that's not normal to the legacy operators there. And so they might not actually get the whole answer. So yeah, it's very likely that there is patches or gaps in that the information is patchy and that there's gaps in the information that does get shared, completely unrelated to willingness to share. It's just how people, dysfunctionality in people communication, right? And friction maybe from that dysfunctionality that we talked about a little earlier, right? From, hey, this situation is not as I'd expected. I was told we would come here and we would find this, and now I'm here, I'm finding that. So that irritation and that friction and the language that people use then in those conversations might also lead to reductions in sharing. I would suggest that none of that is truly malicious. None of that at all, right? It's just human. This is how these things go. This is normal. And that happens. So after a transition period, after upheaval, after change, you really do have to assume that any communication is more dysfunctional than normal. And even in the smoothest of operations, in the best of teams with a lot of consistency, human communication is dysfunctional, right? That's the nature of human communication, unfortunately. And so it's going to be worse in situations like this. And if you do not account to that, you basically are building cracks in the system, right? More cracks in the system. So critical information here didn't disappear. It didn't disappear because people are evil. It disappeared, though, or enough of it disappeared, because people were uncertain. Yeah. Or it got filtered out. Let's get on to the inventory exercise. Because I don't know if you remember all the details, but basically what happened is that this new organization, a couple of months to maybe max a year into taking over operations, decided to do an inventory exercise. So this was a planned outage of some kind, right? Or I don't know if it was a complete outage or it was a temporary reduction of activities. There was definitely at least that. And so they planned for this lull in uptime and had pre-distributed, etc., to an extent to cater for that, and probably had planned to do double shifts or extra work or whatever after to make up for it too. But this was a planned lull in activity levels, and then they decided to add a belt repair or change out in the warehouse in the same period, and they decided to add an IT system change out or replacement in the same period. In itself, the inventory exercise really wasn't a problem. Honestly, I mean, something like that sounds sensible to me, right? It's very normal in all sorts of operations to have this legacy inefficiency there. And it's never that in the middle of normal steady state operations, we suddenly decide to have a spring cleaning, right? That spring cleaning typically comes a little bit after there's been a change out in leadership, or you've had a major strategy refresh and you kind of realize that in order to do some new stuff, you need to get rid of some of the old. So if you're at a bank, this might be one of these exercises where you're actually doing a bigger batch job of closing out legacy accounts. Yes, of course, that should be steady state work that happens all the time, but we all know that actually it doesn't always work like that. And so an inventory exercise like this, to say, hey, it looks like we have way more everywhere than we need. We're not running at an optimum. We're losing value there. Yeah, sounds like a sensible exercise to me, if well planned, right? An operational pause to actually allow for that. Fabulous. Those of you who've been listening a while know that I'm all in favor of saying, well, what are we then not doing whilst we're trying to do this, right? And not try to do everything at the same time. Take a bit of a pause and do this. The real problem here was the scope creep and probably optimism. And the analogy I want to bring into this here is turnaround logic and the no-go thinking that comes with that. For those of you who work in manufacturing plants and in heavy industry, in operational centers, turnarounds are potentially a more common terminology. But here we're talking about the every 5 year, every X years, major maintenance that needs to happen. So even if we bring it down to as simple as a major oil storage tank on a refinery site, every X number of years, these things need to be completely drained, cleaned out. Lining needs repairing, replacement, valves need. And so you need that at system level. And so every couple of years, or periodically, these big assets have major turnaround exercises where they actually completely shut down and do a focused piece of work and then bring it back on stream, right? And so this inventory exercise is a little bit like that. But turnaround planning is, for a reason, an entire discipline on its own. And I will tell you that there is nobody who will say that they've ever had a truly successful turnaround, because these things are so hard. It's notorious for creep and dealing with unexpected surprises, etc., etc. But there is definitely some that go much better than most. And that's because there is discipline about how these are structured, right? Shutdowns expand. They always expand. They always have too much scope. They always have underestimated interfaces. They always don't have enough contingency, if they have contingency at all. And what they do have, they have go and no-go discipline. And they have processes and checks and balances to avoid scope creep. Basically, one of the things you often see in good turnaround planning is that there is some stuff that must happen, right? There is a must-do scope. But then it's like, if we're doing this anyway, for sure, you want to use that opportunity to do some other stuff that also ideally should happen. But what then happens is that the nice to have scope, I'll call it, gets matured, right? So work is done on it. And as work is done on planning that scope, it all goes through these go, no-go points where there is decision made saying, hey, listen, ideally it would have happened now, but we're not ready, or we're not sure enough that we can get all the spare parts for it, or that we can get the people for it. Or yes, ideally, and we could do it, but we can't do it because it needs to happen in the same area where we're already doing a lot of other work. So the chances that we can do all that work when people who do that work all need to work in the same 5 square foot, too risky, right? You need to have a look and a reality check whether you can actually execute all that work in the same window, or if by adding some of this nice to have work, you're actually jeopardizing getting the must do work done. And so in the case of this distribution center, of course, it sounds like a good idea to do repair work on a belt in downtime and to change out an IT system. But what happened is that both of these fixes or these opportunity scopes failed. So I'm assuming that the actual inventory exercise was successful, but when they then wanted to ramp back up to normal operations once that was complete, the belt wasn't working. They were down a belt, and that IT system didn't talk to the other systems already there. And so something went wrong in the scope control here. And you know, it's logic, because those of us who've done this know that if you do a belt repair and it's not happened and you're not familiar, not happened in a long time, what you think you find and what you find are probably not the same things, right? How many times do we think we have a system that is generation 12, and then we take off the covers of the machine, the top parts we see, right? The top part of the belt, etc., is indeed generation 12. And then we take it off and we find out that they actually stacked the generation 12 parts on top of a generation 7 subsystem, because that was still fine. And so they decided to continue using that. And you don't actually have the right tools to deal with that generation 7 system. That's very normal. It's also very normal when you have had a change out or a takeover of an organization that headquarters says, hey, we need this top layer software system or management system or implemented in this location, and we need it as soon as possible, because translating the reporting every month or whatever has been an annoying job. And so top down, that ask and that pressure has been there. And so it's like, okay, well, now we're down anyway, we might as well do it. But maybe nobody was given the job to actually work the downward side. I'm saying downward side because it really feels then like a managing upward situation, right? It's this pressure, you need the system. But was somebody else given the job to actually look and work and the accountability to look at the other part and the interfaces that were happening on the other end of the system? Clearly, Either that role didn't exist, or that work didn't happen, or not enough work happened in that place. And so, yeah, I think time constraints played a role here. What's very clear is that there was no rollback plan or no fallback system, that there was no staged approach in this, because this situation lasted for quite a while, right? Suggesting that basically when they realized that the new system didn't talk to the other systems, somehow they were not able to plug in the old system or the backup or something. So did they replace an IT system right on the wire when the license on the old system ran out, or what happened here? But even then, even if you know what happened, it doesn't make sense to not have a fallback option. That belt and that belt repair, okay, I get it, right? Maybe there truly was just really some unfortunate incident that couldn't have been foreseen that led to a huge delay on that belt repair. But if you then find yourself in that situation, there should have been a flag, right? There should have been an escalation that says, okay, this is going to take 3, 4, 5 more weeks or however long it was. What are we now going to do to close that gap? Because truly living with it that long and there not being a recovery suggests that there wasn't a plan in place, or there was not a plan made quick enough to try and at least recoup something. So when you do a turnaround or a change out process, or you take a pause to do some systemic work, you need some realism here, right? So the scary part here is not that the new system failed or that overhaul failed. The scary part is that there didn't seem to be a clean way back or recoup. So let's summarize. What are some of the warning signs that should have been picked up, or that you should be on the lookout for to avoid scenarios like this? There was an organization under pressure shortly after acquisition, no doubt, right? There was promises around the value that was going to be generated and how awesome and amazing, how good this would be. And then reality kicked in. And was that reality, that real reality dealt with effectively? Yes, an inventory cleanup was needed. There was legacy integration complexity, no doubt. There was no doubt some operational friction and people still getting used to each other. So there was suboptimal communication, unclear contingency planning, some simultaneous major changes. There was too much optimism, communication gaps also, no doubt, and an increasing dependence, by the sounds of it, to making this particular timing work. And then by the time all of this became visible publicly, the real problems were kind of already old, right? Then it's like, okay, now we're in this situation. How do we recover? So I want to bring it back to that CK case, right? And business continuity planning or wargaming, where we started. Really, if you are working in a business that's dependent on systems, but really any business, right? Both of these businesses should have done some business continuity planning. If you're doing, you should do it for your standard basic operations. But if you're having a major turnaround like that, you can also and should also really do it at that level. Then you maybe don't want to write a whole business continuity plan. You maybe just want to war game it or do that particular exercise on paper for an afternoon. In oil and gas, we definitely do these drill the well on paper exercises because the whole process is so expensive that we basically put everybody in a room who has a role to play in that process and work through the whole process together verbally on paper, right? To figure out where we all may run into challenges, and that every party around the room understands from each other what role they're playing in that game. Because by the sound of this, if you would have done anything like this in that exercise of the warehouse, right, there is quite some things there that you probably would have caught out around the system replacement, around the belt replacement. There is people in that organization who would have pointed out which things were missing in the plan. Business continuity planning is not a fear-based thing, right? It's not about we avoid it because we don't want to think about these things happening. But it's the practical thing to do. It's the practical thing to do to make sure that you can safeguard the value in your business when things go wrong. That's exactly why business continuity planning matters. Because the plan won't be perfect. It won't. But it will expose your assumptions. It will identify dependencies. It will help your team train and work through these exercises when the emotions are not running high. And so it will train that muscle so that when they need it, it's not somewhere, in the attic, 7 shelves deep in a warehouse nobody's been in for months, right? It's something that's been in your life and relatively recently, something similar you actually talked through. It activates that improvisation muscle that you really need in these situations. So one of the most valuable things leadership teams can do is really take an afternoon and work through a realistic failure scenario. Because as I said in that episode 2 weeks ago, it sounded like a case that we all say, oh, but that doesn't happen to us, right? A lineup of so many little cracks that you get a big break. In reality, it happens to all of us way more than we're willing to admit. Yeah. And it can happen to us. We can have a system outage. We can have a major supplier failure. We can have major facility downtime. We can have a key person being unavailable. We can have a cyber attack. And we can have that be the thing that makes all our little cracks possible, or we can have some of these things happen in conjunction and that being enough. You learn very quickly where your organization actually understands itself and where it doesn't by wargaming your way through it. So the lesson from these situations is not to not change anything. The lesson is understand complexity before complexity understands you. Most business emergencies are not lightning strikes. They are slow-built situations that finally run out of room. And if you wait until the rupture happens, your options will shrink very quickly. If your business is growing fast, is integrating systems, is post-acquisition, is scaling operations, or is heavily dependent on a few key systems or people, you should probably test some scenarios right now, not when things are already breaking. And honestly, that's one of the most useful things an outside facilitator can help you with. Come in, challenge assumptions, ask uncomfortable questions, and help leadership teams work through what happens if this stops tomorrow. It's much cheaper to stress test reality than to recover from it later. Thank you for tuning in today. To have you back on another episode of the Business Emergency Room soon. Bye now. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.